Coming to you from the Forge of Freedom studio in the heart of America. A podcast dedicated to preserving freedom and inspiring personal success. Freedom is born and lives through you, the individual, and it dies in the shadows of tyranny. Motivating our listeners to become well-rounded, freedom-minded people with the body of an athlete, the mind of a stoic, and the spirit of a warrior. The tree of liberty lives on through you, the Forge of Freedom. And now here's your host, Alex Ooley.
Hello, everyone, and welcome to another edition of the Forge of Freedom podcast. I'm your host, Alex Ooley, and this is episode 41 of the Forge of Freedom. Today, I have attorney and firearms instructor Mike Ooley back in the studio for Monday Gun Day. We're going to continue our series about self-defense and get into the aftermath a bit more. Today, we talked about the 911 call and safety after self-defense the last couple of weeks. And this week, we're going to get into interacting with responding law enforcement. Welcome to the show again, Mike.
Hey, Alex, good to be here.
So, as I mentioned last week, we talked about maintaining safety at the scene after self-defense, because there's this gap between when you actually use a firearm in self-defense during that critical incident and when responding and investigating officers actually arrive to the scene, including EMS and other people potentially. So this week, we're going to talk about how you should approach that interaction once responding officers do, in fact, arrive at the scene. So you want to say, I think maybe just a little bit recap a little bit from last week. You know, we've got the three rings of safety, and this week the responding officers are arriving.
Yeah, and I think it is important to. I always hesitate. These things overlap so much, these different phases, and I don't want to repeat too much. Except I do want to set some context again that's applicable to all of those phases, whether it's the 911 call, your safety on the scene, the officer safety, bystander safety. But it's important again to reiterate the context that this is going to occur in terms of the physiological effects that a life or death situation is going to impose on your body, or is going to cause in your body. Not only your body or your being, but also the police officers, bystanders. Everybody is going to be going through this chemical dump where adrenaline and other chemicals are saturating your body and making some changes. And it's important that you be aware of those and think about these things ahead of time. So just keep in mind, you're going to be going through that chemical dump. You're going to get auditory exclusion. You're going to have impaired vision, which may include tunnel vision. Time distortion is going to go on one way or the other. Things may speed up. Things may slow down. It may, and by the way, mentioning all these doesn't mean you're necessarily going to suffer from all of them, but it would be unlikely that you would go through this and not suffer from some. You may have sort of an out-of-body experience where you feel like you're not even there. You're looking at it from a drone standpoint. You're going to get memory distortion, which is why it's important. If you say anything, you don't say a whole lot, not because you're going to lie, but because you may get events wrong, completely wrong. You may get things out of sequence. There may be periods where you just don't remember at all. You may create non-existent elements to fill in the gap in your memory, not because you're trying to lie or do anything wrong, but because of these stressors that go on in that context. So that's why we want you to have 2 or 3 sleep cycles before you go into any kind of detail about the incident.
That's actually an interesting concept too. I just mentioned real briefly here, sorry to interrupt, that our mind has a tendency to try to make sense of what happened. And even if we don't actually know or didn't perceive everything that happened, our brain, there's this effect where our brain tries to fill in the gaps. And oftentimes where our brain fills in the gaps, it's wrong. We don't actually know what happened, but we try to rationalize the situation. And that's why a lot of attorneys, and we're going to get into this a little bit, say after you're involved in any kind of incident like this, you should just say nothing. But we're going to actually talk about some other advice where you may actually say something to the responding officers.
Yeah. So keep in mind, you're going to be under this enormous stress, others as well. That's why we talked about your safety. So there's no inadvertent discharges of a firearm that hurts anybody else by the police or you. But yeah, it's important to understand this and to understand that, prosecutors and lawyers and judges and juries are going to have the benefit of sitting in an air conditioned or heated courtroom and using their cognitive minds with an infinite amount of time and resources to nitpick what you did. And they're not going to be under the enormous pressure that you were at the time.
Yeah,
So
they'll have the benefit of 20/20 hindsight and an air-conditioned room to analyze and pick apart the actions that you took.
yeah.
And the other thing I'd like to mention here real quickly, I've talked about, we're kind of doing a series here. I've created a playlist on the Forge of Freedom channel so that you can access all of these easily. It's the Monday Gun Day playlist under the Forge of Freedom.
Yeah. So to continue to set the context, you or someone else has made the 911 call. I'll refer you back to the previous episodes to go into that. You've done everything you can to ensure your safety, your loved one's safety, family members, friends, bystanders, police officers. You're doing what you can. Refer you back to the previous episode for that. But what we want to talk about specifically today, what are you going to do when the first responding police officers, probably uniformed officers in marked patrol cars, show up at the scene? It may be, depending on where you're at, maybe 2 minutes, maybe 20 minutes or longer, who knows? But what do you do and what do you tell those first responding police officers at the scene? And I think we've broken it down into two general thoughts or camps in terms of what you probably ought to do here. The first one is is the majority opinion held by most attorneys, and that is do not say anything at all to the police. This is typically going to come from criminal defense attorneys. Criminal defense attorneys represent criminals and people that are guilty, and there's no question that that's the appropriate advice to give if you're guilty. And it's not surprising that that's the majority advice that comes from most criminal defense attorneys. So if that's the advice, there doesn't have to be a whole lot of practice there.
We could say this video is over, right?
Yeah, it's over. That's
end.
it. The end. But it's not. And I will mention one thing, a couple of books here too that I think may help you out. Jim Fleming wrote a book, Aftermath, Lessons in Self-Defense. And Jim Fleming's passed away. Time gets away from me. 2 or 3 years ago, he passed away. But here's the book. And I think, read the book, but I think he falls under the camp of just don't say anything. He was a police officer, a criminal defense attorney, firearms expert, but read his book and he makes the argument that just don't say a thing. All right.
Yeah, sorry, before you move on, just real quickly, I'd like to, on the don't say anything camp, I'd like to mention a video that I think is quite effective at making this argument. I watched it in law school, and Masad Ayub, I think, mentioned it during his class that we took with him several years ago. It's called Never Talk to the Police by Professor James Duane. And Andrew Branca, who wrote The Law of Self-Defense, also has some commentary on that video as well. And I think it's helpful to listen to the arguments on both sides, the don't say anything approach and the say a little approach, which we're going to talk about here. So I'll link to that video by Professor James Duane and also to the commentary by Andrew Branca. And then, of course, to the book by Jim Fleming, Aftermath, Lessons in Self-Defense.
Yeah. And by the way, I'm not, I think for the vast majority of the people out there who don't spend a great deal of effort in terms of training or reading and preparation, there's no question the completely remain silent camp is the one you ought to be in. But with that said, I think there's some valid reasons, and you're leaving something on the table if you don't at least explore option 2. Keep in mind, you got to be prepared for this, but please don't misunderstand what we're saying about option 1. I mean, there's no question you have a right to remain silent. Most attorneys are going to invoke that. And they're encourage you to do that. And by the way, I mean, invoking an unsupported claim of self-defense is a problem as well. So, just keep that in mind. If you want to explore option 2, which is to say a little, there definitely has to be a self-defense, a scintilla of evidence to support a self-defense claim before you start invoking that affirmative defense. So let's talk a little bit about option 2. Now, your book for option 2 probably is Masad Ayyub's work. He published his first book, In the Gravest Extreme. I think that's the place to start. But I have another more, I won't say more modern because the concepts are the same, I think. But another book that he has out called Deadly Force. And there's a chapter or a section in there about this option 2 and what to do when the police roll on the scene and what to say. And I would commend you to that book if you want some further details beyond what we're discussing today. But anyway, most attorneys disagree with this option 2 to say a little. I would point out to you when attorneys say absolutely don't say anything, they would have to acquiesce that it's probably you need to call 911. So you are saying something, even if you call 911 and say send police to 1234 Main Street, USA. And we're not telling you ignore the protections of the Fifth Amendment to remain silent. Just use it judiciously is what we're talking about here. Not necessarily recommending, but talking about. If you do say a little, this is your chance to make a good first impression and kind of lay the groundwork for a valid self-defense claim here. And, you know, they always say, I don't know what the saying is, but something in effect, the first impression is the best impression or something like that. I'm not sure what the saying is. But it's a chance for you to kind of set the playing field, so to speak. Also,
and we're trying to establish what Masad Ayyub calls the active dynamic, which we started with on the 911 call and talked a little bit about in a previous episode.
Yeah, and that active dynamic is that you were attacked and you had to defend yourself, or you or another innocent person was attacked and you had to defend yourself. And by the way, this say a little is probably going to be most consistent with what police officers are trained to do if they're involved in a shooting. They're going to say there's going to be a little bit that they're going to say, and then they're going to be quiet after they say a little bit about what went on. So anyway, this is a way for you to espouse the fact that there is evidence or grounds to support a self-defense claim, and you may not be you may not have to testify then down the road if you make some small statement about what went on at the scene, that there was some evidence of self-defense. So this is a way to get that evidence in, or at least get some testimony to that effect, and you won't necessarily have to be cross-examined by a prosecutor. Here's what we kind of think that if you're going to evoke this option 2 of saying a little, probably what you ought to do. It ought to be limited to something like, hey, that guy attacked me. I had to defend myself. Those 2 or 3 people over there were witnesses that saw it. There's some evidence over there. He dropped the knife in the trash can. There's some cartridge cases there, that sort of thing. And that's probably all you ought to say, other than to tell the officer, hey, officer, you know how serious this situation is. I'll be glad to cooperate fully after I've had a chance to consult with my attorney. And then after that, just continually assert your right to an attorney in silence after that. But that's all you're going to say if you say anything and opt for this option number 2.
And I think I'd like to break this down just a little bit. So number one, you're establishing the active dynamic. I was attacked. That guy attacked me. I had to defend myself. You're establishing that I was the victim. And that's sort of what you're trying to do by saying those things is sort of change the trajectory of the investigation from the start, because the police that are showing up, they don't know who the good guy is. They don't know who the bad guy is. When the prosecutors get the police report, they don't know who the good guy is. They don't know who the bad guy is. And it may take a long time to sort that out, even if you do say these things, but it may help get the investigation going in the right direction from the beginning.
That's right. We want to do that. That's consistent with what we hope happened on the 911 call. So the picture is being painted here of what really happened, and it makes it easier for the first responding officers to sort that out. And then they pass their information on to the second echelon, which may be the detectives. This also, by identifying witnesses, some people just don't want to get involved in the situation. So that's the best way to preserve the fact that there are certain witnesses that may have relevant information with respect to what happened and to support your position, because witnesses will, in some instances anyway, kind of try to disappear and not be involved.
Yeah, especially if there aren't cameras around.
Yeah,
they may be difficult or impossible to find.
Yep. The other thing is with regard to witnesses or evidence, a scene is subject to being disturbed once first responders, whether it's EMS, paramedics, police officers, bystander, whomever, shows up on the scene. So it's a good idea to go ahead and help the first responding officers do what they can to preserve this evidence. And once again, this is a situation where you've legitimately used self-defense. We want those witnesses identified. We want the evidence preserved to support our claim.
Yeah. But to be clear with evidence in particular, remember what we talked about at the beginning of this episode and in previous episodes, the context in which this is happening, right? You're going to experience all these physiological effects, time distortion, maybe distance distortion. You may have auditory exclusion. You may not, in fact, know how many times you fired your gun. So don't talk about things like distances or the numbers of shots fired or times, things like that, because your perception of those things may be skewed. So we're talking about more generic information about evidence, like there's the guy's knife, that's where he came from, those sorts of things. Okay.
And then after you've had those 2 or 3 sleep cycles with your attorney, you'll be able to put together a more accurate depiction or a more accurate, I won't like to use the word story because that sounds almost fictitious, but you'll be able to put together a more accurate recollection of what occurred.
So you're going to establish the active dynamic. You're going to point out witnesses and you're going to point out some evidence. What next?
Well, the big thing is politely and respectfully, you're going to indicate to the police officer and repeatedly, if necessary, that you're going to talk to the police officer. You understand how serious this is. I want to cooperate and I intend to fully, but it's important that I talk to my attorney first. And then after that, you'll have my full cooperation. And that's it. You're done. Period. End of discussion at that juncture.
And if responding officers or investigating officers continue to try to pump you for information, you should continually assert your right to remain silent at that point and your right to speak with counsel until you've had an opportunity to consult with counsel.
Yeah.
After that point, you may agree to talk more.
Yeah, that'll be between you and your attorney. And most, I think, the vast majority of police officers will understand this position fully because that's the position that they would take if they were involved in a situation where they discharged your gun in self-defense. That doesn't mean some officers won't still try to pump you for information that you shouldn't be providing, but most officers, I think, officers will understand that. I think there's some, if we want to move on, there's some other kind of a litany of important points we probably ought to make with respect to this interaction with the first responding officers. And by the way, once again, this is talking about those first responding officers that roll upon the scene. We're not talking about maybe detectives that show up that want you to, give a statement down at their office or this, though that's a situation there's just completely off limits in terms of you speaking until you talk to your attorney.
So let's talk about a few of these other important points to remember.
Yeah. I mean, first of all, never, ever, never lie to the police. 2 things are going to happen if you lie to the police. Number one, they're going to find out you're lying and now you're going to have other problems. Okay. Or the other thing is that, that's the biggest thing I think at this juncture.
Yeah. It's going to kill your credibility with not only the investigating officers, but then also with the responding officers, the investigating officers, and then furthermore, the prosecutor.
Yeah. Another thing, I've already mentioned this, don't agree to any kind of interrogation without your lawyer and consulting with your lawyer first. We've told you just to say a little bit here, potentially. We're not telling you what to do. You're going to have to make that choice. But if you do go with that option to say a little, which once again, a lot of people would vehemently tell you not to do, it's not a situation where you're going to try to talk your way out of an arrest or something. That's not what the objective here is. And you may get arrested. And if you do, you get arrested. That's not the end of the world.
And to be clear too, I think from our perspective, this is totally a personal choice, whether or not you decide to talk a little or not say anything at all. And we think that it is better if you can accomplish option 2 by saying a little, because we think it will be helpful to your case. We think it will help maybe dispose of your case before it's even charged or not charged at all. But if you don't feel comfortable saying anything, you're probably best off saying nothing.
Yeah, because the worst thing you can do is say too much.
Yes. Yeah, it's called logorrhea. It's basically diarrhea of the mouth, where people in the aftermath of a traumatic incident, no matter what it is, tend to say too much.
Yeah. And by the way, that brings up another thought. It's amazing to me how many times in a situation like this, folks talk to the media, whatever. And I don't know what that's about. Just somebody with a microphone that people think, oh, I'm a big deal now. I'm going to get to talk to the media. I mean, whatever the reason, absolutely 100% do not talk to the media about whatever happened.
The problem with the media is even if you're perfectly telling the truth and saying exactly what happened, the media doesn't always report exactly what you said, or they make cuts, or they take it out of context. So it's very dangerous to talk to the media, and we would say under no circumstance should you talk to the media in the aftermath of a self-defense incident.
Yeah. And once again, you may be arrested. You may lose your firearm or firearms, so be prepared for that. If you are arrested, a little pointer is be careful about who you talk to in the jail in terms of other inmates. Just if you're seen talking to certain people, that may be the jailhouse snitch, and that person goes to the prosecutor. And I mean, you may have been talking to the guy about your favorite color, but then he goes to the prosecutor and says, hey, Alex just told me that he did this, that's whatever. And that may be used against you, even though it's a complete lie or fabrication.
Yeah, and even though there may be no audio recording of your conversation with that other inmate, there's likely going to be a video recording of you talking to him.
Yeah.
And they can say, oh, look, he did in fact talk to this inmate
for 2 minutes, and he had enough time to confess to the crime at that juncture.
Yeah.
Although you were talking about the weather and your favorite color, whatever. So, right. Like I said, you're going to lose your firearms. One of the questions that comes up, should you go to the hospital? I don't know. Once again, you're under that chemical dump. I'm going to say it's probably not a bad idea. Probably should. Some people will tell you absolutely should. I think you ought to at least be checked out by the paramedics there because of this adrenaline rush and all the other associated things that are going on physiologically. I would say that there's a substantial chance that you may have injuries that you're not even aware of, or may not become aware of until later. So I think it's a good idea to probably get checked out, even if you don't think you're hurt. Number one, to get the medical care you need. But number two, it's very, very, very important to document any and all injuries that you have, even the slightest bruises and things like that may have come from the self-defense incident.
Yeah, I think it's certainly prudent to be seen by EMS at the scene. Whether or not you should go to the hospital, I think, is less of a concern. Obviously, if you're injured in something that requires going to the hospital, you should go. But I don't think you should request to go necessarily just as a matter of course.
Yeah, I mean, it might be a good idea, but you certainly need to talk to the EMTs or the paramedics at the scene. And once again, absolutely document those injuries, and your attorney may need to be involved in that as well. The other thing that I was going to talk about a little bit today is your discussion with family and friends. Well, one other thing about the medical. Keep in mind, if you go to the hospital, whatever you say to the medical personnel may end up in your medical records. So just keep that in the back of your mind. But the next thing I was going to talk about a little bit was, what do you say to family and friends after this is over? And it's important, I think, to understand this, because your communication with other than maybe your spouse, depending on what jurisdiction you're in, your communication with family and friends are not protected by any sort of privilege. And they may be called to testify about things that you've told them. Maybe, depends on the evidentiary situation at trial, but they may be called to testify about what you told them or didn't tell them during your conversation. So I think it's probably good. Once again, we talked no media. But it's probably a good idea just to say, I had to defend myself. This is, I look forward to getting this worked out in the legal system. And in the end, it's all going to come out okay for me. And that's about all I can say.
Yeah. The other thing that we didn't mention earlier, we talked about the possibility of the jailhouse snitch, but you may also have the opportunity to make a phone call while you're in jail if you are arrested. But you have to remember that all of your communication, they even have text messaging in jails now, all of that communication is recorded. So be sure to be careful about what you say on any jail communication system.
Yeah, and that's interesting. Would you agree with me that there are people there have been people in jail who would not have been convicted based upon the evidence that the prosecution had at the time of their arrest and incarceration, but for subsequent calls that defendant made from the jail?
I would say that that's absolutely true. I think oftentimes the case doesn't even reach trial because of how bad the calls are in the jail. So it encourages the person to take a plea of some sort. But then if it does in fact go to trial, they are convicted where they otherwise likely would not have been convicted, but for those jail phone calls.
So there you go with respect to the importance of jail phone calls.
Yeah. And oftentimes, I can speak from personal experience. One of the counties where I work, the prosecutor's office has someone whose job it is basically to listen to all these phone calls and to jot down information about what they hear. So they are listening to those phone calls.
It's almost as if the government could arrest people under the relatively easy standard to get with many judges of probable cause and just wait for him to say something incriminating in custody. Imagine that.
Yeah.
Anyway, not saying that happens, but
yeah. So we've talked about two options here, just to recap a little bit. Option one, say nothing at all. Just invoke the right to remain silent. Don't say anything to responding officers or investigating officers. Option two, say a little, where we establish the active dynamic. We point out that that guy attacked me. We had to protect ourselves. We point out potential witnesses and we point out evidence. Okay. Then we politely indicate that, officer, we understand this is an important situation and we will be happy to cooperate after we've consulted with our attorney. Okay. And then continually assert that right to remain silent until you've had that opportunity to talk to your attorney. So this is a personal choice, right? I mean, you have to decide whether or not you are prepared for the aftermath and prepared to limit yourself to this limited interaction. And if you're not prepared for that, absolutely don't say anything at all.
Correct, because the third option of saying too much is by far the worst option.
Yes. Yep. All right. Anything else you think you want to mention about this subject, Mike, before we wrap it up?
No, just remember about talking to others. I was going to finish that up. Other than your attorney, depending on your jurisdiction, maybe your spouse, priest, minister. Other than that, there's no protection for what you say to others necessarily. So,
all right. Well, thanks again, Mike, for joining the show. I will link to, keep an eye out for the show notes. I will link to the books that Mike mentioned, Deadly Force by Massad Ayub, Aftermath, Lessons in Self-Defense by Jim Fleming, and the videos that I mentioned from James Duane and Andrew Branca. So definitely check those resources out in the show notes. And next week, we're going to continue our series on self-defense and in the aftermath of self-defense. So be sure to tune in next Monday for Monday Gun Day as we continue the series.
One thing that just occurred to me that I didn't say that I intended to say, I'm not a fan of folks that have a card in their wallet and they're going to pick the card out and read from it to the police officer. I'm not necessarily a fan of that. You do whatever you think is appropriate, but with respect to this topic today, I wanted to mention that.
Yeah. So I've created actually a playlist on our YouTube channel with these Monday Gun Day episodes. So you have easy access to those. I'll link to that in the show notes, and be sure to stay tuned for next week's Monday Gun Day episode, where I'll be on again with Mike to talk about, to continue our series. All right. Thanks again, Mike.
Thank you.
Thanks for listening to this episode of Forge of Freedom. Be sure to subscribe wherever you heard this podcast so you never miss a future episode. For more information or to connect with Alex, you can go to forgeoffreedom.com or follow him on Twitter @ForgeOfFreedom. Until next time, remember, you are the Forge of Freedom.